Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Basics of Bitcoin tonight. Before I introduce the presenter, I'm going to hand it over to Linda from the Peters Township Public Library Foundation, who has a few words to say.
Hi, everyone. I am Linda Lavinka, and I'm with the Peters Township Library Foundation Board. I'm really happy to be here. The foundation is a group of 12 members who are dedicated to the library, both financially and as volunteers. We support as we open books, doors, and minds in our community. We augment the library's budget, which comes from township taxes, by providing funding for many of the library's programming. So that's what we try to do. We help try to enhance programming and enable the library to offer wonderful programs like this. Some of the other things we do is we have a book sale. We just had it this past weekend to raise funds for the library. And in November, we have Novel November coming up on the 3rd. And Andy Ware will be the presiding author. He will be speaking. We're super excited. We're partnering with the Carnegie Science Center on this. And Andy Ware wrote the book The Martian, which was made into a film by Matt Damon. And he'll be talking about his new book, Project Hail Mary, which will be made into a film next year with Ryan Gosling. So if you would like to know more about the library, you can certainly reach out to the Library Foundation Board. You can reach out to Sydney or other people at the library. We would welcome to you calling us, giving you more information, and hopefully being as devoted to the library as we are. Please come visit us, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. A few housekeeping things. Everyone's camera and microphone are turned off for right now, but feel free to use the chat feature. Chris will be monitoring it during his presentation. So if you have a question pop up, feel free to use that. And then at the end, we will have time for Q&A, and we'll turn cameras and microphones back on for that. So this evening, we have Dr. Chris Wilmer from University of Pittsburgh. He's co-author of Bitcoin for the Befuddled and co-founder of The Ledger, the world's first academic journal for blockchain research. And he is assistant professor of chemical and petroleum engineering at Pitt. And tonight, he is going to be presenting about Bitcoin for us. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Chris.
Thank you, Sydney. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, great. All right. So then I'll get started. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here and talk about the very basics of Bitcoin. Just a little bit about me, and then we'll get into the meat of the subject. But I first learned about Bitcoin in September of 2011 from a Wired magazine article. It was called "The Rise and Fall of Bitcoin," and it described Bitcoin as this failed project. I was a PhD student studying chemical engineering at the time at Northwestern University, and at that time, Bitcoins were about $3 each. And this article talked about, again, like I said, Bitcoin is this failed experiment. Because apparently earlier that summer, unbeknownst to me, the price was higher than $3. It had been, in fact, as high as 30, and now, like, the bubble had burst. We can all go home. There was a lot of pessimism in the article that mostly sort of washed over me. There was some mention in the article that you could buy chocolates online with Bitcoin, and as you can imagine, I was very confused as to what this Bitcoin thing was. I couldn't understand anything the article said about it. But I thought, well, I'll teach myself by going online and somehow buying chocolates with these Bitcoins, whatever they were. And there was very little at the time that you could buy with Bitcoins. There was someone out there who was making chocolate Bitcoins, as pictured on the slide. And if you sent that person Bitcoins, they'd send you chocolate Bitcoins. There was another person who was making these beautiful metal coins with the Bitcoin logo on them that he called physical Bitcoins, and you could buy those if you sent them Bitcoins. But there wasn't much else you could buy back at the time. And in fact, using Bitcoins, even though some people might argue it's tricky today, it was much harder back then. And keeping Bitcoins safe was hard. As I was learning, I needed to get some Bitcoins before I could use them to buy chocolates, and I was finding it was pretty difficult. I had to learn about just keeping Bitcoin safe was hard. I had to learn about public private key cryptography. And one of the things that I came across as I was learning, going through this educational process, was this concept of a brain wallet. You could send Bitcoins, once you acquired them somehow, from your phone or laptop to your brain, and then those Bitcoins only existed inside your head, and then you could send them from your brain back to your phone. And for me, learning about that, that was my first sort of aha moment, that there was something really unique and special about this sort of new Bitcoin technology, whatever it was. And this was clearly something you couldn't do before Bitcoins were invented. And I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology. When people talk about blockchain technology today, that's the sort of, it refers to the same thing as Bitcoin, but in a more abstract sense. As a point of context, historical context, at the end of 2012, Bitcoins were now trading for $15 each on the various marketplaces, but we're still mostly known for facilitating online drug sales via this now defunct website called the Silk Road. In 2013, as I started to appreciate that Bitcoin was this potentially useful technology, in talking to my friends and colleagues who were widely skeptical, I realized that this was still a highly misunderstood subject, and there were very few resources one could read about Bitcoin that weren't full of errors. And so I'm not the only person. There are other books out there, but I co-authored a book called Bitcoin for the Befuddled with my colleague Konrad Barsky. And this book, we're actually currently writing a sequel called Crypto for the Confused, but it still does a good job of explaining how Bitcoin works. Anyway, in case anybody here is interested in a book on the subject. Another point of historical context, towards the end of 2013 in October, the United States had its first Senate hearing on Bitcoin, and there was a lot of fears or expectations that this was going to be the real end of Bitcoin, as the regulators and the government comes together to finally destroy this this strange technology that was facilitating online drug sales or whatnot. But actually, the Senate hearing turned out to be very positive. Overall, the tone was of trying to help this innovation flourish. There was, of course, discussion of regulations. And very shortly after, the price of Bitcoin went from around $15 to over $1,000 towards the end of 2013. The last thing I'll say about me, and Sydney mentioned this, is that once I became a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, I worked together with a number of cryptocurrency researchers around the world at other universities, and we co-founded the world's first peer-reviewed research journal for cryptocurrency related subjects. And it's published right here at the University of Pittsburgh, but the research that comes out of it is from all over the world. And now I'm going to stop rambling about myself and talk about what Bitcoin is. And what I have found is that the best way of understanding what Bitcoin is and how it works is actually to go back in time and try and understand, why was Bitcoin invented in the first place? And even though Bitcoin formally was invented in 2008, that's when it was sort of first announced to the world, really the main work behind it was done in the early 1990s. So let's go back to the early 1990s when people were first working on what, it wasn't called Bitcoin then, but what became Bitcoin ultimately. Okay. So to go back, here's a starting quote. This is from Milton Friedman, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist. This is just something he said at the time. He said, "I think the internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash, or electronic cash. The method whereby on the internet you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A." And the main reason I provide this quote is just as evidence that in the 90s, when the internet was starting to become, it was growing and something that people talked about a lot. But there wasn't a way to pay for things online. Even though today we pay for things online all the time, at the time you couldn't do that. And so people were working on developing these electronic payment methods that worked in a different way than we use credit cards today. And it's hard to remember now when we do everything on the internet, especially e-commerce, that in the early 1990s, even though there were some enthusiasts and entrepreneurs that thought the internet was going to take over the future, a lot of other people thought it was ridiculous. And as one great example of this, there's this funny article that was written in 1995 by Clifford Stoll. Poor Clifford Stoll. He wrote, "Why the Web Won't Be Nirvana." And it's really instructive to read, excerpts of what he wrote. So I picked one excerpt here, which I'll read. He wrote, "Then there's this cyber business. We're promised instant catalog shopping. Just point and click for great deals. We'll order airline tickets over the network, make restaurant reservations, and negotiate sales contracts. Stores will become obsolete. So how come my local mall does more business in an afternoon than the entire internet handles in a month? Even if there were a trustworthy way to send money over the internet, which there isn't, the network is missing a most essential ingredient of capitalism: salespeople." Now, it's funny because all of these things that Clifford Stoll were ridiculing, like buying airline tickets over the internet or making restaurant reservations, things that he thought will never happen, we do those all the time. You can't buy airline tickets or make restaurant reservations any other way these days. Well, you can still call a few restaurants, but largely people do these things online exclusively. And malls everywhere are going out of business. I mean, the idea that a local mall does more business in an afternoon than the entire internet is, it's particularly laughable. But Clifford was right about one thing. When he wrote this, there was no mechanism for sending money over the internet. There could be a furniture store that could advertise its furniture. It could make a website, show pictures of its couches and sofas. But if you wanted to buy any of those, you would have to mail a check, put a check in the mail and mail it to the company, and then they would ship you the couch. Today we buy things online with credit cards, but back then you couldn't do that. So let's talk about why we couldn't buy things with credit cards in the 90s. Okay. At the time, in the 90s, it was believed that using credit cards to pay for things over the internet was an insane idea, like a complete non-starter. And it really is a very problematic thing to do. We have, every day there is another disaster where credit card numbers get stolen. There's an enormous amount of credit card fraud. But in the 90s, the idea was, the thinking was that credit cards cannot be used to pay for things online. And the reason is that in a credit card transaction, how it works is you give the merchant the exact information they would need to turn around and make purchases on your behalf. Okay, so it's as if, let's say you walked into a pharmacy or something, and you said, "Hello, I'd like to buy a toothbrush." And then the merchant, let's say she's Jane, says, "Sure, that's $5. And then you said this strange thing. You said, "Here's my online bank password. Go ahead and log in and withdraw however you need. Just promise not to take more than $5. Okay?" And then Jane says, "I promise." Right? That's what you're doing every time you buy something with a credit card, because you give the merchant, you want to buy a pizza slice for $3. You pay for it with your credit card. So what do? You give the merchant your credit card number, the expiration date, the 3 digits on the back, whatever. The merchant then has all that information. They give you a $3 pizza slice, then they can walk into any other store, use your credit card information, and buy something that costs many thousands of dollars. And this has already been a problem for a very long time before the internet existed. At least the two characters in our story here had to see each other in person. But with the internet, the thinking was, well, now the situation is a little bit different. Now you're saying, hello, anonymous internet merchant. I'd like to buy a toothbrush. Sure, that's $5. Okay, here's my online bank password. Just promise not to take more than $5. I promise, says this anonymous person in some other country that you've never met. The belief was, at the time in the 90s, even though today we pay for everything online with credit cards, the belief back then was that this scenario here was a complete non-starter. We cannot use credit cards to pay for things online. There must be some other way. And so there was significant investment in the early 90s in developing alternative approaches. Companies like Microsoft and IBM and universities all over the country, their PhD students were, at least in computer science departments, were doing research on electronic payment mechanisms that could work in a secure way over the internet. And there were lots of such efforts. One such effort, just to pick a representative example, was by, I think he looked younger back then, but David Choum, who was doing his PhD at Berkeley. And it was, his whole PhD was on secure payments over the internet, and he spun out a company called digicash. Okay, and the way digicash worked was you would buy eCash. Okay, so you'd buy some arbitrary points from the digicash company. So you'd give them $100 US, and then you get 100 eCash points. And maybe you'd have to mail them a check or give them $100 bill or however that worked. But at that point, then you had these points that existed on their account system. Then you could go to websites like a furniture store or whatnot, and you could spend your eCash online at participating merchants. So if there was a merchant that accepted eCash, you could pay with eCash. And unlike credit card transactions, those transactions were very secure. The information you provided to authenticate the payment didn't allow the merchant to then turn around and spend your money. So it worked very, very well. And the company, digicash, kept track on a spreadsheet on a computer that they owned, who owned how much eCash. All of their customers, all of the participating merchants, they kept track of who had how many, which at some point could be then redeemed for US dollars. As you might imagine, this new startup company, digicash, faced a lot of obstacles. Like any startup, they needed quick adoption, but consumers were slow to adopt because digicash hadn't had time to earn their trust yet. A lot of consumers, again, back then in the 90s, were skeptical about the internet, let alone buying things online and handing over their money to some company, digicash. The company also needed permission from many different financial regulatory agencies. They needed permission at the state level, at the federal level. They wanted to operate in multiple countries, and every country had state and federal level financial regulators. And sometimes those financial regulators had contradicting requirements. Some financial regulators in some countries, were big on protecting consumer privacy, and said, you have to make sure that your consumers aren't providing, information that could be then stolen or whatnot. And other financial regulators had the opposite requirements. They said, you have to make sure that your consumers provide, where they live and all these other personal details because law enforcement, needs to know. So that was very challenging. And then there was this very fundamental problem that even if digicash was doing fine, which it wasn't, but even if it was doing fine, the very idea that maybe as a startup digicash might go bankrupt, which happens to startups all the time, meant that people were reluctant to use its technology, just because what would happen if digicash went bankrupt, right? You give digicash $1,000, you get 1,000 eCash points. Then digicash, the company, goes bankrupt. And what happens to your money, right? You have these eCash points. Can you redeem them back for US dollars? You're probably stuck. And just the idea that that might be a possibility meant people were reluctant to adopt the technology. Digicash was just one such company. There were dozens and dozens of others. They all went by different names. Digicash had eCash, and other companies, came up with their own point system, and they called it eGold. there was one company, particularly the one that their product was eGold, that they followed an Uber-like model. So Uber, the company, is sort of infamous for operating in cities and not asking for permission, sort of asking for forgiveness, not permission. And so eGold did the same thing, and that allowed them to sort of grow faster. But then the founders of the company ended up going to jail because financial regulators, really take their anti-money laundering laws very seriously. Even if the eGold founders, had no malevolent intent, it's just that was the challenge of the environment back then. In summary, all these different startups ultimately fizzled out. We have, none of them exist today. And in the meantime, Visa and MasterCard more or less figured out how to make online payments work with credit cards with this very clunky brute force solution. Okay, the way, and this is how all of our e-commerce works today. But the way it works is when you buy something with a credit card, whether online or in person, Visa and MasterCard, they charge the merchant a significant percentage of the transaction. It can be anywhere from 3% to 10%, depending on the context and the merchant. And then a lot of that money is reserved to cover fraud. A big chunk is used to cover fraud, which inevitably happens, and another big chunk is used to pay for private detectives, pattern detection algorithms, and they basically watch that merchant like a hawk for the next 5 years after they receive the credit card payment to make sure that they don't abuse that privilege of having that secret information. And then you have to issue new credit cards every few years. So it sort of works if you accept the idea that credit card fraud, is a constant, and they're always, you always need to allocate billions of dollars every year to pay for it. Okay, so then 10 years later, more or less, in 2008, there was this essentially academic paper that was distributed on a cryptography mailing list titled Bitcoin, Peer-to-Peer Electronic Cash System. And it was written pseudonymously by this person, Satoshi Nakamoto. To this day, we don't know who he or she is. And it's a very short paper. It's actually very easy to read. If you look at, and importantly, if you look at the references, the citations in the paper, you'll notice that Satoshi mostly cites the research from that mid-late 1990s period when all the research was being done on enabling electronic cash payments. And so Bitcoin really is very, very similar to what David Chaum developed for digicash. It just has one very important difference, one key difference that maybe will lead to success where all the prior efforts failed. And that is that whereas all the prior attempts at developing eCash relied on some central administrator, some company, some trusted authority to keep track of who had how many eCash points, Satoshi developed a system where a network of computers that anybody could participate in could voluntarily keep track of who had how many points. Okay, you can call those points whatever you want. You can call it eCash or eGold. Satoshi decided to call those points Bitcoins. And so those Bitcoins are just these arbitrary points. And Satoshi developed this protocol for how this voluntary network of computers could just sort of voluntarily, it's a volunteer group of people that, everyone keeps track of everyone's Bitcoins. And in this way, Bitcoins can operate without relying on any particular company or any particular authority figure. It just sort of exists. Once it's out of the bag, it sort of exists on its own. That can be a little bit confusing. As a Canadian, that's where I'm from. I'm from Toronto in Canada. I'm partial to this metaphor that this University of Toronto researcher put forth once about Bitcoin. He said, Bitcoin is like hockey. Okay, hockey is just the collection of rules that describes a particular sport. nobody owns the rules of hockey. And if anybody wants to change the rules, they can do so as long as they don't mind playing by themselves. It is possible for the rules of hockey to change, but only if everyone agrees to the new rules. Bitcoin is the same way. You could also describe Bitcoin as like the English language or the Spanish language, right? You can't, sometimes this is important when having discussions like, well, can't a government just ban Bitcoin? I mean, it's like trying to ban a language or trying to ban a sport, right? There's not some particular company or some particular people you can throw in jail. It's just a set of rules, and anybody who participates in those rules is basically making Bitcoin work. Okay. So in 2008, this was a sort of scholarly paper. In 2009, this scholarly paper was implemented as a computer program, and people started using it to send each other these Bitcoins, these sort of arbitrary points. And it was sort of an academic experiment, right? It was just run by enthusiasts. People were sending each other these Bitcoins. And then in 2010, there was what was sort of widely believed to be the first commercial transaction, if you can call it that, involving these Bitcoins, where some forum user said, hey, if anybody orders me 2 pizzas, I will send them 10,000 Bitcoins. And this is now known as the infamous Bitcoin pizza transaction, because at the current market price of Bitcoin, this user paid $400 million for those 2 pizzas. But at the time that it happened, people thought that he got a better deal. He gave away these worthless Bitcoins and he got some real pizzas out of it. So later in 2011, people started exchanging Bitcoins for other currencies, not just US dollars, but euros and yen, and developing currency exchanges that operate really like any other currency exchange, where you deposit one currency and you exchange it for another. And you can see here a little price chart from back then, where in 2010, 2011, where Bitcoins were trading for 10, 20, 30 cents per Bitcoin. Today, Bitcoins trade at approximately $40,000 each. And it's not just that. Since the ideas were sort of publicly distributed and the computer programs that were written to make Bitcoin work were open source, people were able to copy the Bitcoin source code and make their own versions of it. And very shortly after Bitcoin was released, people copied it and pasted it, and they made some small changes, and they gave it their own names. And people made Sarah Coin and John Coin and Litecoin. And there are now thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of cryptocurrencies that are all nearly identical to Bitcoin. A few of them have some, interesting innovations, but they're really all very, very similar to Bitcoins. And in aggregate, those cryptocurrencies are, have a value of over $1 trillion. So, which is pretty amazing, given how recently none of this existed. And it all sort of started as, what is essentially like a computer science experiment. A little note about terminology. So, first there was just Bitcoin, and when people wanted to talk about the technology, they talked about Bitcoin, the technology. But once it was copied and pasted, and there were these other things that were like Bitcoin, at that point, if people wanted to specifically refer to the Bitcoin, they would say Bitcoin. But if they wanted to refer to the broader technology, they used the word cryptocurrency, because there was some currency aspect to this, to what people were doing, and there was a use of cryptography, so that's how the word cryptocurrency came into play. However, in 2013, 2014, there was a sort of a slow but collective realization that cryptocurrencies could be used for non-financial applications. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a few minutes. But that you could use cryptocurrencies to store information that had nothing to do with payments. And so there was this new term called blockchain technology that came into common use. And today that's the most general abstract term for referring to the same thing, right? So Sometimes people say that they think cryptocurrency is stupid, but blockchain technology is great, or vice versa. But it's the same thing. Blockchain technology is cryptocurrency. It's just blockchain technology is a because it doesn't use the word currency. It acknowledges that the exact same tool can be used for non-financial purposes. And today, blockchain technology is sort of an active area of research and innovation. As I said, the Ledger, the journal that we started, publishes lots of research on the subject. Lots of universities and professors around the world are doing research in this area, trying to find areas where blockchain technology might be useful and make the world a better place. Okay, so it may be a little confusing that these cryptocurrencies can be used for non-financial applications and why people call it blockchain technology. So let me explain what blockchain technology is, and then we'll come back to how this all works. So blockchain technology is just a method of storing data. We have lots of different ways of storing data. So, I mean, you can store data on your computer, you can store data on a piece of paper, you can store data, on Microsoft OneDrive. So why consider blockchains as a method of storing data? So let's think about different ways that we store data. Okay, so as I said, you can store data, you can store information on a piece of paper. You can also store it on your computer. Why would you do one or the other? Well, typically storing things on a computer is a lot more efficient, right? If you want to write down someone's name, maybe it doesn't matter, paper's fine. But if you want to write down 10,000 names, it's much faster to do it on a computer, particularly later if you want to then search through those 10,000 names or so on. So no question, computers are way more efficient when it comes to storing data. But how about resiliency? Like, what if there's a fire? Well, if there's a fire, the paper burns, but the computer melts, so that's not good. So is there something better? Well, you can have a database on multiple computers that stays synchronized. It's generally just as efficient, but now you have this additional resiliency. There could be a fire somewhere or a flood or an earthquake, but you don't lose any data because that database is automatically synchronized. So that's like, for a lot of us, maybe you use iCloud or use Dropbox or Microsoft OneDrive. That's what this is, right? And it works really, really well. Okay, what else do we sometimes care about when it comes to data storage? Well, sometimes we care about tamper resistance, right? What if you have a spreadsheet with financial information and some hacker logs into your computer and changes some numbers around because they want to steal information or something, or tamper with some records? Well, the fact that this database is automatically synchronized with other databases doesn't really help you, because you make a change on one computer and it automatically propagates to all the other computers too. We have solutions for this too. There are what are called linked entry databases. This is like, imagine Dropbox or iCloud or Microsoft OneDrive, but with version control. Okay, maybe you've used documents with version control. And in this case, any change you make, there's a history of all the prior versions of that data. So a hacker, and maybe an accountant wants to embezzle money, or a hacker logs in or something and makes their changes, but someone can tell that there was evidence of tampering because they can go back to the older versions. Okay. So far, no reason to use blockchains. Okay, so let's consider another feature, immutability. All these other forms of storing data share in common that there is always some central administrator who, if they wanted to, could delete the entire database. Microsoft could just shut down OneDrive, Apple could shut down iCloud, Facebook could take all of its user data and throw it in a dumpster if they wanted to. All of those forms of data are not immutable. The unique thing about blockchain technology is that because there's no central administrator, because it's like hockey or Spanish or a virus, there's nobody in charge. There's no person with the power to delete anything on a blockchain. It is a little bit less efficient, but it is massively resilient and redundant. There's no way to tamper with the data. And because there's nobody who runs the Bitcoin blockchain or the Litecoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain, there's no one who can delete anything on it. So anything you upload to the blockchain is there forever. Nothing can be done about it. And we'll come back to this again in a moment. I'll just mention, because it's a little bit funny, when my brother got married, he uploaded his wedding vows to the Bitcoin blockchain. He is now divorced, but he and his wife, no matter how much they want to, can't remove their wedding vows from the Bitcoin blockchain because it is there forever and there's nobody to ask to delete it. Okay, so we talked about Bitcoin, this electronic payment technology, and we talked about blockchain, this immutable storage technology. Well, what is the connection between the two? Well, blockchain is sort of a new word. Satoshi did not invent the word blockchain. But what Satoshi did invent when Satoshi invented Bitcoin was Satoshi invented this method where this voluntary network of computers kept track of everyone's Bitcoins. And so Satoshi needed to invent a database, right, that this voluntary network of computers maintained. And it happened to have a structure where it was made of blocks that were chained together cryptographically. And so that's the blockchain that we refer to when we say blockchain. And what people realized years after Satoshi's invention was that that database that Satoshi needed for all these computers to keep track of everyone's Bitcoins, that same database could be used to store any other data. So you can upload weather data, poetry, medical data, as I said, my brother's wedding vows, to the Bitcoin blockchain. And that network of computers will store it in that database and they'll store it forever. And one of the reasons that this, I say this network of computers is voluntary, but it's also extremely robust. It's, there are a lot of online services that we use that occasionally go down. Like I use Spotify, and there was a time when Spotify was inaccessible because its servers were down, or same thing with Facebook. But the Bitcoin network has never gone down in the, and now 12 years it's been online. It's an extremely robust network. And one of the reasons it's so robust is there are many, many computers that are, always participating, keeping it online. And I say it's voluntary, but they're actually, each person who volunteers, so to speak, volunteers to maintain the Bitcoin database gets paid for their services. They get paid in Bitcoins. And so this financial incentive is what keeps this voluntary network of computers very, very robust. You may have heard about Bitcoin mining and miners. Those are actually the people who maintain the Bitcoin database. And the reason they do it is because they get paid in Bitcoins to do so. The word mining is a little bit of a poor choice of terminology. I think it would have been much more clear if instead of calling them Bitcoin miners, they were called the Bitcoin database maintainers or something. But anyway, the terminology is what it is. Okay. So, you can listen to me prattle on about Bitcoin for hours and still probably not really be clear on what it is or how it works. I think to really understand how it works, the best thing to do is just to try using it. And so what I offer when I give these talks is if you just go to the website, bitcoin.com, you can download a wallet on your phone and then you can receive cryptocurrency. If you email me, and my email is wilmer@pitt.edu, I will just send you $5 of Bitcoin Cash. And then you can just send some to someone else, or there are restaurants in Pittsburgh where you can order Chinese food or something that accepts cryptocurrency. And what you'll find, this is what most people tell me when they do this, is that it clicks for them in a way that it didn't when they were just thinking about it. And so you don't need to spend lots of money to just try and use the technology. You can buy $1 worth of cryptocurrency and just make some transactions. Or as I said, I'll send you some and you can just try using it. So, and this Bitcoin.com, there are lots of other websites. As I said, there's no person who runs Bitcoin. It's just somebody made the website on Bitcoin.com, and that wallet happens to work fairly well. So that's why I recommend it. But there are lots of other wallets you could choose from. In the last few minutes, I just wanted to briefly talk about, where might blockchain technology might actually be useful as a technology, not necessarily for payments. So the important thing is to think about situations where there's no appropriate neutral custodian for data that everybody trusts. Okay, there has to be some lack of trust for there to be a reason to use a blockchain. One good example of this is domestic versus international patent disputes. Okay, so let's imagine that there are two American inventors that both invent some very, very important invention, like the cure to cancer, at about the same time. And they both file patents for it to their local patent offices. Maybe we can trust that the American patent office will be impartial in trying to decide which of the two was first in inventing this, right? Because the person who's first gets all the money and the person who came second gets nothing. So it's very important to figure out who was really first, and if they both came up with the idea at similar times, that can be very tricky. But what happens if there's an American inventor who comes up with a cure for cancer, or something else, a laser that generates energy, or who knows what, and then there's a Chinese inventor that comes up with the same thing at about the same time, and they both file to their local domestic patent office, the American to the American patent office, the Chinese inventor, the Chinese patent office. And the same thing applies. Whoever's first gets the intellectual property ownership. Can we really trust when the American patent office and the Chinese patent office, duke it out, that they'll be impartial as to who came first? Or are we worried that they'll both back their own local domestic inventor? So that's a situation where there's no higher body that can resolve that dispute. If the American inventor and the Chinese inventor had both uploaded their invention to the Bitcoin blockchain, there'd be it'd be indisputable who came first, right? Because that is a data storage that nobody runs. There's no possibility that anybody tampered with it or changed the date on the invention or switched something around so that the person who came second actually looks like they came first. Both the American patent office and the Chinese patent office can just look at the Bitcoin blockchain and be absolutely sure, yes, this is the person that came first, this is the person that came second, without any suspicion that there's any shenanigans. Custodians can also be well-meaning but unreliable. So for example, I use Dropbox. Dropbox is great, or maybe use iCloud or Microsoft OneDrive. But if I had an important document that I needed to upload somewhere and be very, very sure that it was going to be there in 20 years or in 50 years, I wouldn't trust that if I uploaded to Dropbox, it'd still be there in 20 years. Because Dropbox might go bankrupt or might decide that its business isn't profitable anymore and it'll shut it down, and maybe it'll send warning notices after a few years saying, please migrate your data. But the Bitcoin blockchain, 100% is going to be there for sure, because there's no person to shut it down, right? I mean, it's not going to go away. There's no burn rate. There are no employees to pay. It's just going to exist forever. Another thing to think about is, are there incentives to cheat when the stakes are really high, right? And so one example of this is a doctor being sued in some multi-million-dollar insurance claim case where it all hinges on what did the doctor write in their patient records, right? Did they do the right thing? Did they recommend the right thing to the patient? And there have been many cases of doctors being found guilty of tampering with their own patient records to absolve themselves of responsibility for a patient dying or having something go wrong with them with a medication that they shouldn't have received, because there's this large incentive to cheat for these big insurance claim cases. And if that same data had been uploaded to a blockchain, it'd be impossible for the doctor to tamper with them. And of course, when this kind of fraud happens, who pays for it? Ultimately, it's all of us pay for it in terms of higher insurance premiums. So there's a potential, win-win if medical records were stored on blockchains instead. And then not that eliminates every kind of fraud, but it eliminates completely all the fraud that involves retroactive tampering. There have also been, examples of police deleting evidence from their databases when it was inconvenient for them, which is another case where, maybe a blockchain would be helpful. With that, oh yeah, right. Here's an example of a Pennsylvania doctor that was caught, changing records on some patient records using, a similar pen to make it appear that the entries were made on the original date. So these things do happen. But with that, I'll stop rambling, and I will leave some time for questions and discussion if there is any.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. I turn everybody's mic and camera back on, so feel free to unmute yourself or turn your camera on if you have a question, or you can drop it in the chat as well.
And I see there's a question in the chat, so I can start with that.
Go for it.
Mike Palumbo asks, are non-fungible tokens just a use case of cryptocurrency? Yes. So you may have heard in the news or seen headlines about NFTs, or especially in the last few years, NFT and digital art sales. So, as people have made millions of different cryptocurrencies and giving them, silly names like barbecue coin or Dogecoin. So you can also make a cryptocurrency where there's only one of that currency, right? So with Dogecoin, there are millions and millions of Dogecoins, but you can make a cryptocurrency where there's only one of that. There's only one currency unit, and when there's only one currency unit, it's not fungible, right? Fungible means there are many units that are, completely indistinguishable from each other. That's what the word fungible means. So when you make one of a cryptocurrency unit, it is a non-fungible cryptocurrency token. And what people do when they make these non-fungible tokens is they kind of state that this token, I declare this token represents ownership of something, right? And that can there can be legitimate uses for that. You can use that for saying whoever has this token among the people where we recognize the system will be considered to be the owner of this car. And if you want to sell the car to someone, you have to transfer the token to them. Recently, people have used this for artwork, so sales of artwork, where they issue a token that is tied to that piece of art. And there's a longer discussion there. But the second part of the question was, won't this database be extremely huge and unwieldy? So yes, these databases they do grow with time. And that's why I mentioned that they're a little bit less efficient than other data storage technologies. So typically with Bitcoin and a lot of these other cryptocurrencies, you can upload arbitrary data, but only very, very small amounts. And so what it gets a little bit technical, but when people say that they upload medical records to the blockchain, sometimes what they do is instead of uploading the entire medical record, they upload like a representative part of it, or there's a term where they take a cryptographic hash of the medical record, which is a very, very small file size, and that's what they upload. But the short answer is yes, the databases do grow, and so that's a potential problem with that technology. I don't know if there's any other thoughts or discussions. Does anybody have cryptocurrency? Want to admit it?
I will say I think I told you via email, Chris, that we tried to buy your book, but it is currently out of print. So okay. Without spending an astronomical amount of money on Amazon, it wasn't going to happen. But I'm very excited to hear that you guys have another one. You said that was called Crypto for the Confused? Crypto for the Confused is the working title. We'll see. Gotcha. If keep it. I don't see any more questions on my end. If no one has any other questions, do you have any final thoughts or anything you want to share? Words of encouragement or words of caution?
Just what I said before, that, I mean, again, if anybody, you can email me here. If I'll put up my email again. You can email me at c.wilmer@gmail.com or at wilmer@pitt.edu. And if you have any questions, or if you download a cryptocurrency wallet, I will send you a few dollars that you can play with. And I think that will, you'll find that it makes the concepts click a little better.
Okay. I see one more question that came in. How do you know what type of crypto coin to buy, since there are so many options out there now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it can be very confusing. I would say the one I recommend just to get started for educational purposes is Bitcoin Cash. One of the issues with it's not as popular as, say, Bitcoin, or the two most popular are Bitcoin and Ethereum. So those are the most popular ones. One of the problems with the really popular cryptocurrencies is that the network can be a little bit crowded, and there can be some transaction fees that it can be a little bit more costly to use. But Bitcoin Cash, the transaction fees are negligible. It's essentially free to use. And so I think if you want to just learn about it, I would suggest Bitcoin Cash.
Okay, thank you for your question, Judy. And if no one has any other ones, thank you so much for your time this evening, Chris, and explaining some of the basics. And we'll see if we have any brave souls who take you up on your offer.
Okay, my pleasure.
Okay, I'm going to stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any questions for the library. Otherwise, have a great evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us.
All right, bye, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.